thank you for having me, and thank you for bringing Colombia to discussion in this environment. This is very exciting. You probably gathered I'm from Colombia, and I'm excited to speak a little bit about my experience with the peace process, especially with the FARC. So in my presentation, first I'm going to provide you with a summary of the guerrilla movement, specifically the FARC and EP. And also through the process you'll see the numerous attempts of the government to achieve peace with groups, specifically with FARC and them. This presentation will give you context to the current peace process and also maybe some reasons why there's a lack of trust of many Colombians. Because the story is more than 50 years of war, of violence, and broken promises from both sides. So, as you probably know, or maybe not, Colombia, the FARC is not the only guerrilla group in Colombia. Colombia had many guerrilla groups in their history, more than 60 guerrilla groups that we have dealt with in this. The FARC is one of the last standing ones. Why was such a numerous amount of guerrilla groups in Colombia? There's two main reasons that have been identified. First, the political violence it was a time in history where political ideas were so strong that the political party that was in government was opposed by the other political party, and they enforced arms and violence, especially in rural areas and from farmers. And the second cause is the social need to acquire land. And Colombia has a very vast territory where land is very rich. So the government doesn't make presence in most of the rural areas. So the colonization of these areas and mobilizations of farmers was one of the causes for the creation of numerous movements of guerrillas back then. So specifically with FARC, they are considered a first-generation guerrilla. And they have also, because they have an influence from the Cuban Revolution and the Communist Party. So initially they had some communist ideas that came through, and they have support from the Communist Party in Colombia. They also have some influence from the first nationalist groups, so groups that work with oil workers and liberal guerrillas from the Middle Magdalena and the Oriental Plains. Work with them. So there was, when the FARC was created, there was a movement called the New Progressive Left in Colombia, and their goal was to achieve social justice through armed revolution. So it's basically, you can see the influence of the Cuban Revolution back then. Okay, now moving to the specific history of FARC. During the first decades of the 20th century, the Colombian Communist Party supported self-defense groups of agrarian farmers to fight for social justice. So these were small groups in the rural sectors, and the Communist Party just supported them so that they would be self-defense against the government. They saw the government as an oppressive force, so they created self-defense group of farmers. They were encouraged to fight for the right to own the land that they work and to profit from their labor. So land was divided, and it was owned mainly by landowners and the owners of farms and productions. I'm speaking about production of coffee specifically. And then they would lease the land to farmers and workers, or they would just hire workers to work the land. But the farmers and the workers that would lease the territory, they wouldn't get much payment from their work. So they decided to, with the support of the Communist Party, start to fight for for the rights to actually see the profit from the work that they were putting into specifically coffee farms. The conflict was intense, especially in coffee farms and plantations in the regions of Sumapaz and Tequendama. And in those specific regions, the group of workers actually claimed for the abolition of private property and in the favor of the workers to acquire those lands that they work. This was accompanied by a big economic crisis in the 1930s and by President Olaye's policies that were looking to modernize and industrialize the farms. So taking out workers and bringing in more industrialization and modernization, which didn't really sound well with the farmers at that point. It is important also to note that during this period of time, the Colombian rural population was 70% of the total population, so it was mostly rural and farmers. Okay, so the breaking point came in the 50s. During the 50s, the political environment in the rural areas was so intense, and the antagonism between landowners and workers was growing exponentially to the point that in some areas, just to keep the peace, the government bought the lands from the landowners and divided amongst workers. The workers decided to organize then in small independent republics in some areas of Colombia, and they selected their own government and their own rules at that point. So that wasn't really a good outcome for the government because they were losing the control that they have over the land with these small independent republics. But at that point in the 50s, this process was somewhat ignored because it was viewed to be far in the rural areas and not really centered to urban areas. So people didn't really work much about it as long as it wasn't close to the big cities. This oblivion helped these small groups colonize the territory that was considered no one's land. So they keep expanding, walking, and acquire more territories and just putting them together to these independent republics that they were creating. So the government tried to negotiate peace with farmers in several occasions, non-successfully. And this is a huge story of promises and broken promises and fights and wars at this point. Until in 1955, in Villarrica, the government decided to just go in with full military forces, assassinated most of the farmers, and took over the city. That's what gave origin to the South Bloc, which is the first name of the FARC-EP, and it was created and born as a defense group against military forces. Since then, the organization had an exponential growth. During the 60s, they went from 48 men to 200 members. And by the end of the year 2000, FARC counted with 17,000 members, grouped in 108 war fronts and 29 detachments. It wasn't until President Salvador Vélez that he achieved the goal of reducing their military power to 11,000 members. He defeated 5 of their war fronts and 7 of their detachments. So why and how a group of farmers keep war for 50 years? Part of the success and the sustainability of the war is the financial model that the FARC is using in Colombia. Is based on basically the colonization of territory through violence, displacing citizens, the depredation of natural resources through illegal mining, the kidnapping, extortion of businesses, multinationals, oil companies, and individuals. This is has been calculated that brings them around $120 million per year, and more recently, drug trafficking, which brings them more than $400 million per year. So all this is the financial model that they're using, and is very sustainable, as we have seen in 50 years of war. And all of these points were included in the current peace treaty that has been negotiated in Cuba. So the peace process in Colombia is not new for Colombians. The main negotiations with almost all groups of guerrillas in Colombia took place from August 1982 to January 2002. And at this point, every single group agreed to dismobilize and to being reincorporated in the community with fully recognized political and civil rights. And that's the example of the M19 group that happened during this period of time. But FARC and LL.M didn't really take the opportunity to reincorporate during this process. Why didn't they negotiate peace as all of the others did? There's some factors that impacted the possibility to negotiate peace with them. Some of them are the tendency to negotiate without stopping the attacks, the abuse of their force on civil population. This abuse of force makes civilians fear them, but not really sympathize with their ideals. So it turned the farmers and the civilians against the ideals of them. The forced recruitment of children and a general lack of trust from civil population come from extortions and lies and drug trafficking. So some of the governments that tried to negotiate peace with FARC, Belisario Betancourt government in 1982, Andrés Pastrana Arango that took place from 1999 to 2002, and Álvaro Uribe Vélez more recently. So why this process is different? The power dynamics of war changed after the Álvaro Uribe Vélez presidency. So right now, FARC is not close to achieving a military victory and gaining political power through war, so they're far to winning the war. But that doesn't mean that they're not an established, organized armed group with military and economic resources to continue the war for many, many years. And they are far to be defeated as well. On the other hand, the Colombian military forces are strongly trained to fight, and they have achieved important military gains that foster their morale and confidence on victory. So both sides are very strong, and if the war keeps going, it could last several years. One of the things that actually prompted the negotiation of peace as is happening now is that in September 2010, the President Juan Manuel Santos notified the world of the death of the Mono Jojoy, which was one of the leaders of FARC. And this was one of the big military hits to FARC, and it turned and it changed the dynamic of war at that point. Some say that forcing them into considering seriously negotiating peace. So the recent negotiation of peace lasted 5 years, was signed by the government and FARC on September 26, 2016. And as part of the agreement, it included a compromise to be submitted for approval of all Colombians through a plebiscite, where citizens were able to agree or disagree with the final document. After a short but very controversial campaign from the government and from the opposition, the document was rejected by 50%, 50.23% of votes against 49.76 votes. These results showed us that even though everybody's together in wanting to end the war and achieve peace, but it actually broadcast the division, the political division that the country is going right now. So, what are the elements of negotiation right now? So there's the opposition group submitted 500 areas to be revised in the final document. That was brought to FARC in Cuba, but only 60 modifications and specifications were included in the new agreement. Those are, some of them are transitional justice. In the final document, there's the creation of a special jurisdiction of peace. And this is one of the points that's been mostly criticized by the opposition. In the new agreement, the special jurisdiction remains. However, there would be no international judges deciding the cases. And instead, these international agents would be able to participate as experts in the decisions, but they would not be able to make any decisions on the cases. It also, in the new agreement, it also includes a second instance of the process, bringing the Constitutional Court above the transitional justice jurisdiction. That's one of the points. The second point is the limitation or restriction of freedom for the militants who confess. So the opposition groups are asking the government to have the ex-militants of FARC go to jail and pay some further criminal charges. Obviously, FARC doesn't agree with that point, but they have included in the second treaty that the limitation would be the limitation of movement would be limited to some areas in Colombia that would be created just for the militants to gather while the implementation process. So they haven't really identified which areas of the country those would be, but the idea is they would not go to jail, there would not be jail penalties for their crimes, but they would be basically limited of movement, of free movement to specific areas. Another part that is very controversial is that militants, member of government, and in general anyone that have participated in the conflict that do not collaborate with justice or confess might receive jail penalties to up to 20 years in prison. So these bring not only criminals or crimes from FARC, but also from members of the state and possibly military forces and generals and anyone that had participated in the conflict and did not confess or help with the justice system. And another big point is the possibility to have ex-militants participating actively in politics and to join public positions, including seats in Congress. This possibility remains in the agreement. However, the change is in the agreement that was signed in September. They were going to be appointed to those seats without having to contend in elections. So that was changed in the new agreement, and now they would need to join a political or create a political party and participate in elections to be elected as part of the government. So that was changed. And another big point is the drug trafficking cases. Because drug trafficking has been identified by the Commission as a crime connected to war, it's almost achieving the status of a war crime. And it was going to be persecuted as a war crime. So because Colombia has several drug trafficking cases that are not connected with war, this was considered a problem, and maybe a hole where drug traffic and drug lords could achieve amnesty and pardon of their crimes. So in the new agreement, the drug trafficking cases will be decided individually on a case-by-case basis. So the connectivity would not be part of the agreement, but it would be decided by the court. The third specification was the term, the protection of gender. And in the previous agreement, gender was not defined by the agreement. And the opposition just voted that instead of talking about gender, they should be talking about women specifically. So that was another change. So what is next? See there in the picture, Noel and they're the opposition to the treaty, two ex-presidents that are opposing the treaty, and Juan Manuel Santos, which is obviously the government president, recent peace winner. So the country is right now in a very deep political division. The ratification and signature of the revised agreement is scheduled for tomorrow in Bogota. However, members of the opposition are not comfortable with the revised agreement and are calling for a second plebiscite. Obviously, President Juan Manuel Santos doesn't want to do a second plebiscite for this matter because he knows that he has a very good percentage of possibilities that he would lose again. So instead, he's considering of getting the agreement approved by going through Congress. and tomorrow we'll see what happens with all this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, when I was asked to take part in this panel by Joanna Quinn, the director of the Transitional Justice Center, I was a bit surprised. I told her Colombia was not one of my cases, but Joanna said, that's okay, just talk about peace agreements in general. And since Joanna is a hard lady to say no to, and she makes a request, I agreed, but then without telling her I changed my mind. And so instead of talking about peace agreements in general, which I don't think would be terribly useful, possibly of no use at all, I've decided to talk about really a mixture of the general and the specific in peace agreements. So what I intend to address can be boiled down to three questions. All three general and specific, somewhere in between. The first is what trends may be observed in peace agreements. Peace agreements have been with us for a long time. Right? Peace agreements in the 21st century are really quite different from peace agreements 20, 30 years ago. So what trends, and where does the Colombia agreement fit into the way in which peace agreements have been developing? Second question I want to address is, what is the success rate of peace agreements? And what are the criteria of success? Very important question, I think. Both, two questions. How many peace agreements actually succeed, and how do we know? And finally, what peace agreements are the closest to the one proposed for Colombia? Which peace agreements seem to be parallel in some sense, or have something to teach us that might be of value in our consideration of the Colombia agreement? And so I would like to begin with a little quantification, which is unavoidable when you have a political scientist on your panel. There is no agreed method, even of counting peace agreements, for reasons I won't go into, but there is some good data. The Uppsala peace agreement data set is the most comprehensive data set we have. It puts the total at 216 agreements between 1975 and 1911. 1911 is a significant date, as I will explain later, because it is 5 years ago. Of those 216, 174 of the peace agreements dealt with internal or intra-state armed conflicts, like the one in Colombia. So we have quite a large number of cases. Also, there has been quite a marked evolution in peace agreements over time. And here are some of the trends that I have observed. Peace agreements have become longer, whether you count the pages or the words. They become more elaborate and more ambitious. They now go well beyond the cessation of hostilities. They go well beyond constitutional changes. They go beyond territorial adjustments. They go beyond security and justice measures. Increasingly, peace agreements include measures designed to bring about the redistribution of resources. They also make provisions for extensive reconstruction projects. They include programs to promote healing and truth recovery. what they aim at, sometimes explicitly stated, often implicit, is nothing less than the rather grandiose hope of achieving a social transformation. Peace agreements have come to be increasingly supported by a growing array of international organizations. Now, international organizations, particularly the United Nations, have always been involved, but the most notable change, I think, has been the range of international organizations involved and the involvement of international financial organizations, who tend to impose a sort of liberal capitalist model upon peace agreements as the goal that should be sought. And they have the financial wherewithal to back up their demands. They also put forward plans to spend massive sums of money on various objectives and have organizations designed to put together bodies of donors to come up with the funds, which is another problem, which I can go into later, getting donors to pony up the money they promised. But with all of this, one might well think that peace agreements have never enjoyed more support or better prospects for success. But the results, unfortunately, have only marginally improved over the decades. Again and again, peace agreements fail, or stall, or deliver only a partial, fragile version of peace. Think how often we describe post-agreement societies as observing a brittle peace, a fragile peace, a marginal peace. We're qualified terms of that sort, all I think warranted. Often war ceases, that is, organized conflict between armies, militias, and so on. But war is replaced by intercommunal clashes, rampant crime, and other forms of violence. Burundi is a case in point. The peace is marred by political killings on an increasing scale, economic dislocation, ethnic discrimination, and a profound disconnect between government and people. But as long as there is no outright resumption of war, such cases are counted as successes, and probably rightly so, since however flawed the peace, it is better than war, and there can still be at least some hope that conditions will eventually get better. So what then is the appropriate measure of success? The most commonly applied standard, again using the Uppsala data, is the 5-year rule. If a peace agreement is still in effect after 5 years, it is judged to be a success. I think they might have borrowed that from the medical profession, where if the patient is alive after 5 years after a treatment, the doctors call it a success. So again, what do we find using the 5-year rule? We find that a little over 50% of peace agreements are still in effect 5 years after they were signed. Given the extreme difficulty of transitioning from war to peace, that is not surprising. But in many cases, the agreement was only partially implemented, and the peace is of poor quality. Obviously, other criteria are needed. We need to develop a better tool chest to enable us to measure success. We need, for example, to measure the degree of implementation of the various chapters or provisions of a peace process. We need better measures of levels of violence and types of violence. we need better measures of the number of internal refugees and the resettlement of internal refugees after the agreement, and so on. All of these measures have been talked about, but are in the early stages. So what are the main problems after a peace agreement? One is the grudging acceptance of the conflicting parties of the need for coexistence. Sometimes that's called a lack of local ownership of the process. There are various reasons for that that we'll perhaps pick up later because time is short. Also, another problem is that the core grievances that cause the conflict continue to be unaddressed after the agreement, because those core grievances are often complicated and very difficult to address. Often vulnerable constituencies remain neglected. They might have been overlooked in the peace agreement, or they might have been only touched upon. Attention, I think, broadly needs to be paid to the chronic nature of many conflicts that enable them to continue over many generations and to withstand external pressure. If you look at most conflicts, they don't spring up quickly or out of nothing. They're long-standing. And so few of the peace agreements seem to have a realistic sense of just how long this conflict has been brewing or in existence in some form. Perhaps we need more historians engaged in the study of these processes. And finally, which peace agreements resemble to some extent the Colombian one, and from which we might be able to draw some lessons? Well, there are a number. I'm going to pick out two that I'm most familiar with, and they do seem to be relevant. I'll just mention a few things about them. First, there is the draft agreement for Cyprus to bring together a long divided island, divided between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. Like Colombia, in Cyprus, there were numerous attempts to come up with an agreement to reunite the two parts of the island. So there's a history of failed agreements. Then came powerful pressure after 2000 to finally put together a new agreement that would have success. It was sponsored by Kofi Annan, then the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the agreements were named after him. And so the first agreement reached was called Annan I. Well, Annan I was carefully drafted, excellent agreement, but it immediately ran into problems. Political opposition had to be renegotiated. So the two sides went back to the table and negotiated Annan II. It ran into the same sort of problems, Annan III, IV, and finally Annan V. I had some involvement in the process leading to Annan V, and it would be hard to think of anything left out. In the small territorial adjustments that had to be made on the island, there were teams of geographers poring over every square meter of the territory to be exchanged, teams of lawyers on every legal change necessary, teams of real estate experts on how there might be an exchange of real estate between Greek Cypriots who'd been dispossessed and Turkish Cypriots who'd been dispossessed, following a Bosnian model, basically. Well, anyway, to get Annan V ratified, it had to be put to a referendum. It was decided, the United Nations decided that the only agreement they could get between the two sides was to put it to the people. Here is the agreement, put it to a vote. So simultaneous referendums conducted on the same day, but counted separately on the Greek Cypriot side and the Turkish Cypriot side. Well, the Turkish Cypriots with the most to gain by the agreement, because the agreement would give them standing within the European Union. The Greek Cypriots, with nothing similar as a potential payoff, voted 76% against. So an N5, the most delicately crafted, expertly crafted agreement I think that I've ever seen, went down in flames. And it took only now, right, more than 10 years later, are efforts underway to cobble together yet another Cypriot agreement. This time, who knows, conditions have changed, it might pass. What is the lesson about it? Why did the referendum fail on the Greek Cypriot side? Well, because of internal politics, and you cannot separate peace agreements from the surrounding political environment. What happened in Greek Cyprus was that the president, who was strongly pro-agreement, went down to defeat in a presidential election just a few months before the referendum. The incoming president was strongly anti-agreement. So he went on television, he was a powerful television performer, went on and gave a tearful address to the public, urging them to vote no in the referendum for all kinds of reasons. It would destroy their achievement in rebuilding the Cypriot Republic after the partition of the island and so on. A matter of nationalism and preservation of sovereignty, and so the Greek Cypriots voted overwhelmingly no. Now there will be another effort. Will it have to be put to a referendum? Once you let the referendum genie out of the bottle, can you put the referendum genie back in? That is what they're wrestling with in Cyprus. If they can get an agreement, does it go to a referendum? Because if it does, all bets are off. Referendums are hard things to predict, as we've seen so frequently recently in Britain and elsewhere. The other case that I think bears a lot of resemblance to the Colombian case is Northern Ireland, where, again, the conflict was a very long-standing and had roots that go back centuries. But finally, in the 1990s, with various external pressures applied, the two sides moved towards an agreement, the famous Good Friday Agreement, technically the Belfast Agreement, which was put to a referendum in 1998 and narrowly passed, though the two sides voted together in the referendum. Exit polls suggested that the nationalist or Catholic side voted overwhelmingly in favor of the agreement, and the Protestant or Unionist side voted very narrowly in favor of the agreement. Some dispute that and say they voted narrowly against, but it was very close. And so the next question is, could the agreement then be implemented? And so efforts were made to put the Good Friday Agreement into practice. It immediately ran into trouble and broke down. And then effort after effort was made with international involvement and so on to get it back up and running. Every time it was up and running, it broke down. What did it break down over? Ambiguities in the agreement, and particularly the suspicion on the Unionist side that one of the key parties had not disarmed. You had all of the parties were unarmed except one. And so the principal Unionist party would not agree to implementation until the gun had been taken out of politics. And of course, those who held the guns were exceedingly reluctant to do that, waffled, and threatened their political leaders who had previously been paramilitary leaders, but had made the transition, again, Colombia, made the transition to politics and were under constant threat of assassination as sellouts for urging disarmament. Then external factors intervened. Peace agreements are embedded in domestic politics, but they're also embedded in international events. Because in 2001 came 9/11, and 9/11 changed everything in Northern Ireland. The group that, the IRA was, of course, the group that was refusing to disarm, immediately lost its key external supporters, namely the diaspora or Irish in the United States. They also had the American administration of the day turn against them. They would be branded as terrorists, as supporters of bin Laden and so on, if they didn't disarm. So within 6 weeks, the IRA had decided to decommission its weapons, verifiably beyond use. I mean, there's a sense in which Osama bin Laden can take some credit for the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. But it took yet another agreement, the St. Andrews Agreement, in 2006, before the two sides actually got around to putting the institutions to work. And it has been, I think, a considerable success since 2006. It's by no means perfect, but it's a whole lot better than the uncertainties of the period from 1998 to 2006 and the troubles, the war, that preceded it. The St. Andrews Agreement meant that all sides finally accepted policing and justice as something that the Northern Ireland government would provide. Because before that, the IRA had policed the Catholic areas, and these were essentially no-go areas for the civilian police. 9/11 led to the acceptance of justice and policing as part of the agreement. That brought the extreme party of the unionist side into the agreement, and you got Ian Paisley, the hardliner against the agreement in the first place, and Martin McGuinness, who had been an IRA commander, now turned into a politician, acting as First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And they got along so well that they were nicknamed the Chuckles Brothers. So the politics of it mattered a great deal. The internal politics, the external politics. So what lessons can we draw from these for Colombia? I would say one, and it's this: patience. Patience. For Colombia, the next 7 years will be critical. Not the next 7 months, the next 7 years. It takes time. Look at the time in Cyprus that it took to get to even where it is today. Look at the time it took in Northern Ireland to get from the referendum in 1998 to the St. Andrews Agreement in 2006. I doubt if it will be any different in Colombia, but it's no reason to despair. I think, on the contrary, the experience, particularly of Northern Ireland, provides reason for hope, as long as those who wish the agreement to work stay behind it. So I think the lesson is a simple one, but it's a hard one to actually observe. Let us hope there is some observation of it in the case of Colombia. Thank you.
Greetings to you all. I mean, we've come to we're a little bit behind schedule. Let me say a couple of brief things that I think are relatively important about the peace agreement in Colombia. Let me also say,
I don't know the name of the gentleman or yours. I know that they were.
I'm going to introduce myself and I'll introduce him.
Please.
That's Professor Sid Noel. He taught for many, many years in the Department of Political Science, one of the men I admire a great deal, and so I enjoy having the opportunity to present. My name is Jim Freedman. I taught in anthropology for many years, and I left because of frustration with the university, to be perfectly honest, and it didn't give me the freedom to do things I wanted to do, and I created a consulting firm under which I write and consult. One of the things I've done is consulted on issues of reconciliation in Colombia, but I won't talk. Let me say a word about transitional justice. After my frustration with the university, I left, but the reason I have returned is because of the center. And the center is a very interesting place. It's very unusual. I haven't seen something like that for a long time, and it's got great people in it, and so if you're interested. The issues that come up are like this, like Burundi, like Rwanda, like the problem in the Congo, like the problem in Iraq, like the problems in Afghanistan. And there you get a pretty good perspective. Let me give you my perspective on peace agreement, which I follow. It came very close to La Paz, peace. And if it had been only a matter of a few more votes, maybe there would have been peace in quotes. But to be perfectly honest, it's very, very far from social justice. Now I say those two things because, you know, in international law, you will discover that there's a great difference between peace and justice. All the folds and nuances of this difference are not something we can talk about right now, but there is a considerable difference. And I think in this particular case, we need to realize that while one came with the plebiscite on October 2nd, one came pretty close to an agreement on which the peace side almost prevailed. Really, it's far and away from satisfying the issues of social justice. So maybe I will reiterate what Sid Noel has said. I mean, there's really quite a bit to be done. In that regard, let me call attention to a couple of things that Lina mentioned, but I want to put some emphasis on. First of all, you know, the FARC was originally a social justice movement. And during La Violencia in the 1950s, after that was over, the liberals, politicians who were the activists, went off to southwestern, Colombia, and to Cauca, Choco, Putumayo, Nariña, and there they created, a situation where they thought they had a chance, which was to give the people, the poor people, the opportunity themselves to be self-sufficient, to be independent from the control over resources that the politicians were unwilling to relinquish. So this was their only choice. So the roots of the FARC are in social justice. Let's keep that in the back. You have to keep that in the back of your mind. Admittedly, things went awry, and it became, through its affiliation with drug lords from Peru and from Ecuador, with illegal mining, with kidnapping and so on, it became a criminal organization, the PACRIM. But it has always had its roots in some kind of a justice resolution. Secondly, I want you need to remember that, do you know what the word Gini coefficient is? The Gini coefficient is the measurement that economists use to determine the extent of inequality in a country. The Gini coefficient in Colombia is one of the highest in the world. You might not suspect it. If you go there, stay in Bogota. Bogota is marvelous. Even Cartagena, maybe you went to Medellin, but it's still, you will be deceived, because if you go into the countryside, you will see the extreme poverty and extreme differences, discrepancies in wealth. Let's keep this in the back of your mind, because in effect, there are these differences and these distinctions, these discrepancies are very serious and will bear ultimately on the capacity of an agreement to be passed. But just a short thing before I very quickly move on. I mean, I was there to deal with the problem of landmines. And one of the things that among other things, but one of the things that I was very, very, Colombia is full of landmines, unfortunately. One of the things that I was very, very intrigued by was that the Canadian government had given tons of money to the government. And the government gave the money to the military. And the military was in charge, it's not like this everywhere, but the military became in charge of removing the landmines. And when we were there, we could see as we went to the northern areas and the eastern areas where there was a few landmines, great job. The military was doing a fine job. But when you went to the southwestern parts, you went to Cauca in particular, Cauca, Choco. When you went to these places, where else? Nariño. When you went to these places, you would see that though the military had a semblance of actually removing landmines, in fact, nothing was being done. There is a very, very serious discrepancy between the areas which are deeply affected, where the victims live, the victims of this discrepancy, and in particular the victims of the war between the FARC and the paramilitaristas, and the others, and the other areas. There's a very, very striking discrepancy, which adds to the discrepancy in income and the presence of a rather substantial, I mean, I've worked in countries like, Afghanistan and Congo, Rwanda, and Syria. This is equivalent to some of these very serious places. And if you look at the voting on the plebiscite of October 2nd, you will see the same interesting discrepancy. You find in the southwestern provinces, you find that the majority of, or that there was a very large number, a disproportionately large number of people who voted for the plebiscite. They wanted the unpleasantness of their lives to end. While the opposition to the plebiscite, that is those who were interested in social revenge, because after all, they were the Uribistas were very interested in having some kind of a military solution, that is defeat them completely. Those were, in those areas, you found that the majority of those who voted against the plebiscite. So in effect, although on the surface, the numbers which Lina, extraordinary, great presentation, I mean, you see how close it came. In effect, there is inside that appearance a rather substantial difference between those who consider themselves victims and those who consider themselves, though in control of resources, and who want to maintain that control. So, what are the prospects? Well, I think there may be, I'm sure that Santos, he will not do another referendum or plebiscite. It's too dangerous. And the stakes are very, very high. The stakes for his political career are very high. And he has a very serious opponent, Uribe. Alvaro Uribe has mobilized the opposition against this idea. But it's not only against the idea, it's against the victims themselves. It's against solutions to the poverty which may be lasting. Therefore, let me conclude. What I suspect is that unless there is considerably more attention, I mean, there are all these questions of who's going to be vulnerable to prosecution, what's going to happen to them, can they run for office, can they be, can they run for mayor? Of course, that will help. But the real solution to this problem, which is, in my opinion, having to do with social justice and not peace, is a solution that involves the transfer of resources, but the genuine transfer of resources, so that you can, in fact, mobilize, you can animate the economy of those areas that I've mentioned in the Southwest, which are likely to remain extremely discontented. Great.
So our final speaker, Allison Cordoba. Thank you.
wanted to, actually, I wanted to start by taking Santos off here because I feel like he's peering at me. That's better. I was like, I can't stand up there while he's looking over my shoulder. Okay, so I just wanted to start, I just wanted to ask, are there any people that are from Colombia here? Okay, a lot. Okay, that's a lot of you. I'm more intimidated now. I'm not from Colombia, but my husband is, if that means anything. But I've done my research there, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of points related to my research. But before I get into that, I wanted to talk about what some of the issues of contention were from what I have observed with the peace process. And Lina touched on, I think, pretty much all of them, on the mistrust that is in society between these groups, and about impunity and issues over that, about how will people be punished. So I don't want to go into that. One thing I wanted to elaborate on was the gender issue. So Lina had mentioned that this was an issue that had come up, but she didn't really elaborate. So I just wanted to say this, taking into consideration the social and political context that was happening right before the referendum. And if you're from Colombia, you probably already know this, but I found it very interesting that the issue of gender had come up in the schools. The Minister of Education, who is a lesbian and, you know, is publicly so, had been promoting changes in the manuals for the schools, and this became public knowledge, and there were a lot of protests that happened around the country right before the referendum against having issues of gender, transgender, and the LGBTQ, having those issues be incorporated into student manuals in the schools. And as a result of this, there was these protests, and I think that had a significant impact in pushing the vote to no. It wasn't in charge. It didn't take all of it. All these other issues were very important, but I think that had a very significant role in, you know, people saying, what should we vote for? And because the gender issue had been included in the peace accord, the government negotiator had said that they wanted to use a more inclusive concept of the term gender to include lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, and people were not comfortable with that, or some people were not comfortable with that, as Colombia is predominantly a Christian society. And so this was a big issue, and not that it was necessarily that people didn't want peace, but these are some of the issues with the agreement. So I just wanted to mention that. And then now I'm going to switch modes and talk a little bit about my specific research. And my research was in Choco, which is a province or a department in Colombia, and it's one of the poorest ones in the country. It is the poorest department in Colombia, and there's a lot of Afro-Colombians. So a lot of the history of Choco was that there was a lot of people that were brought over during the slave trade, and a lot of them settled there because the Spanish didn't want to settle there because it was really humid, it was really hot, it's on the coast, and so it's 82% of the population is Afro-Colombian, and there's a lot of indigenous population, and they've remained pretty separate from each other. And so it is, like Jim was mentioning, it's very different if you go to this department versus Bogota or Medellin. I mean, the cities are very modern, and you know, you have all the amenities, things are convenient, but if you go to somewhere like Quibdó, which is the capital of Choco, you know, the infrastructure is very, very weak, and you know, they have power outages a lot, there is not as many vehicles, there's not as many jobs, there's just, everything is much more basic. And so that is where I did my research. And I spoke with, and the reason I wanted to bring in the gender issue was because most of my focus was on women that were displaced by conflict. I did interview some men, but it was mostly women that had been displaced by the conflict and what their ideas about justice and what their ideas of empowerment were. And I want to share with you some of the things that they had in common and some of the points of contention. And I think this is just a microcosm of what is happening on a more national level in Colombia. And so the areas of consensus among, when I asked them questions related to what were their priorities for justice, the areas of consensus were, of course, everybody wants peace. Everybody wants the armed conflict to end, and everybody wants more than that. And I think Sid was mentioning this, is that peace was more than stopping armed conflict. It was also not having the violence in the urban centers and not having this ongoing violence that was just going to take another form, and which a lot of the displaced people were experiencing as they'd been displaced from the countryside and into Quibdó, the capital. It's a city, but there was a lot of violence and there were gangs, and so that was a big issue. And the second priority was that people wanted to live in dignity. And what that meant for the victims was that they wanted to have decent housing and they wanted to have good employment opportunities so that they could provide for themselves. And the third area of consensus for justice was that everybody wanted education for their children. So if they had been displaced, there was a lot of obstacles for education. They would get bullied in school, or they were behind in school, and they really saw education as an opportunity to improve their social economic status for their children and their children's future. So that was something that was very important to them, to the people that I interviewed. So then, in terms of some of the contentious issues, one of the main ones was punishment, and should people who had perpetuated crimes, and I spoke with people that were victims that had experienced violence towards them and towards their family members and had family members killed, and it was very divided about should people be held accountable and how. And so some people said, you know, it's very important, people need to be punished and held accountable for what they've done. And then other people said it's not necessary to punish the guilty, we just want to have peace. And there was sort of a sense of it's not necessarily even possible. How are you going to prove what happened? And it would be such a large scale that it wouldn't even be feasible. And as a side note, when I was there, I was living with somebody who worked in the jails. And in the jails in Quibdó, they were overflowing with people. And they were just like terrible conditions in the jails. And I think about if they're going to have a peace process and they're going to hold people accountable, already the jail system is not functioning very well, at least in that area. And there were gangs that were taking over, and at one point the gangs had taken over control of the prison, and the guards while I was there, had been kicked out. And I wonder about the capacity to actually implement some of these ideas that are written in the peace agreement. So another contentious issue was forgiveness, and I think this goes along sort of with the idea of punishment. Should you forgive? And some people I spoke to said they had already forgiven and that they were moving on, and that was their perspective. And others said they're willing to forgive if people admitted what they had done wrong and asked for forgiveness. And then another group of people said, we're not willing to forgive. We don't want to forgive. Things people have done are just unforgivable. And that wasn't necessarily related to what had happened to them. it was often related to their spiritual or religious views of the world. And then the third one was truth important or not? And some people I interviewed said truth is very important to them. Others said it wasn't even possible to get at truth. And then some didn't really care, but the people that didn't care as much about truth was because nothing had happened to their family members that they didn't know about. So if something had happened and they didn't know what happened, they tended to want to know the truth. But some believed it wasn't possible. So if we think about these different issues of agreement and contention amongst this small group of victims and people that have been displaced or impacted by the conflict, I want to draw out just a couple takeaways for you. And one is, so I think that the peace agreement obviously is trying to address that first issue of no more armed conflict, but it doesn't, from my knowledge of what I have looked at, it doesn't really address the issue of what's going to happen after and urban violence and how, there's gangs in some of these urban centers and as a result of the conflict, and how is that going to be dealt with. And then I think the issues of dignity and education that were very important to victims points to an interesting challenge that the Colombian people are going to face. And it's not so much that in writing, victims' rights have been excellent. Colombia actually has some of the best laws in the world. It's like you have the most progressive laws, but the problem, and this is what people said to me over and over, was that that's great, we have this law, it's not actually being implemented though. So if the laws aren't being implemented, you might have this great peace agreement and be like, oh yeah, that's wonderful, but there's going to be obstacles to actually making that happen. And especially in these outlying areas where there isn't as much of a state presence, there isn't as many resources, and like the case with landmines, is it actually happening? Maybe there'll be some places where they're like, yes, we're implementing the peace and we're implementing, the victims have right to certain stipends, or they have right to certain resources, and they're getting them in some cases, but in other cases they're not. And I think that's a bigger problem. And I think that the areas of contention, so the over punishment, forgiveness, and truth, but mostly punishment and forgiveness, point to there isn't just one homogenous group. Like the victims' voices aren't homogenous, and they have different perspectives within that. And so I think that's important to recognize and to value and to realize that people have different priorities. And so I think for the referendum and for the peace agreement, Choco voted I think it was 80% or higher, that they wanted the peace agreement. But I know that there's other areas that have been impacted by the conflict that didn't vote yes. And so I think it's important when we think about Colombia to just think about it's a very diverse place. The people in Choco do not have a lot in common, I don't think, with people in Antioquia. They're very different cultures, and so all of that is trying to come together in this peace agreement. And one last point I want to make is that something that was also very strong in a lot of the interviews was that justice and responsibility was up to the government to determine. Yet, at the same time, this leads to a lack of local involvement and a lack of ownership over what is happening and the process. And I think that that's going to have some longer term effects, because there's been sort of a top-down discussion of a lot of these issues with what some might argue more superficial involvement of local leaders that have actually been in the communities and working with victims. So, thank you.